How's it going, everyone? In today's video we're going to be diving into one of the most iconic bass sounds in electronic music. You'll hear it used throughout a lot of modern tracks, but its roots actually go way back to the 80s and 90s. This bass sound is one of those simple yet incredibly effective sounds which is very easy to integrate into your projects. It's slowly become one of my go-tos in almost every project, and I'm confident by the end of this video it will become a staple in yours too. Let's dive right in. After listening to the preview, some of you might recognize the sound we'll be covering in this video, which is the lately bass, also known as the solid bass. In this section, I'm going to start by giving you a bit of background on the sound with some examples. Then we'll move on to part 2, where I'll start showing you how to kind of integrate the sound into your projects, giving you tips on everything from samples, plugins, MIDI patterns, and audio processing. Up first, we'll start with a quick history lesson, basically covering what is the lately/solid bass. The lately bass, aka solid bass, is an iconic synth bass sound that shaped 80s and 90s electronic music. This bass sound originates from the Yamaha TX81Z synthesizer module, which was released in 1987. Known for its deep, punchy, and slightly metallic tone, this sound was popular because it cut through mixes effectively, and it added a certain weight to bass lines. Just in case you weren't familiar with that kind of sound, I'll just run through a few examples. First one is this one by Wigfield. This one you hear, it's a very prominent kind of bass. You've got this one. We've got this one. You'll see how the sound is really helping to cut through the mix. You'll hear the kind of prominent role it's having on these tracks. It's just one of those like really iconic sounds that you hear in so many records and you can instantly tell what it is. I think the first thing and the most important thing to nail is going to be that sound. You've got a few approaches here, mainly samples or plugins. What I actually do when I'm using the lately bass sound is the majority of the time I use the same sample. I've basically used this kind of lately bass sample, which actually comes from a plugin called Rave Generator, but I'm aware that the Rave Generator plugin doesn't work for everyone, so I actually created a sample pack which had pretty much all the samples from that. That lately bass sample is probably the best one I've found. I'll play it without processing. So if I'm giving you one go-to tip from this whole video, it's to go and check that sample out. I just find it has the right amount of character to it, which are very identical to those qualities we discussed before, that kind of metallic tone. Something else I could try if I want to go down the sample route is some other providers. What I could do is I could go to Google, I could search either lately bass or solid bass. Keep in mind that the tones are slightly different. If I show some examples, we'll start with lately. You'll hear there's basically subtleties in the character of the sample. If I search solid, you'll see they're very similar, which is why people often use the two terms interchangeably, but I think, like I kind of touched on, the solid bass is a bit of a warmer sound. So the first approach you can use is obviously going to be samples. The next one, which we've kind of touched on, is plugins. I don't actually think there's many plugins out there that have very good kind of lately presets. I think you can only kind of replicate that truly through the actual machine and the specific preset. So the Rave Generator plugin we touched on is obviously a sampler, so it's using that sample. We've got another one which I've touched on. This one's by a company called Meatbeats. It's basically a sampler, but for different bass sounds. So you'll see here you've got loads of different solid and lately sounds, which we'll just skim through. So we've got fem basso, and then I know people often like to get a good insight into how you might do it from scratch. The way I've kind of tried to emulate that lately sound is using two basic waveforms. What we've got here is we've got one saw wave, and we've got this kind of second oscillator, which is a sine, but you'll notice the levels are down. What we're essentially doing is we've applied this kind of frequency modulation from B, so you don't actually hear it, it's literally just applying frequency modulation to the first wave. The next thing we've done is we've done that kind of classic filter modulation using a very short envelope, and we've kind of cranked the drive up to bring out those high frequencies. You'll see it still needs a bit of tweaking, but kind of goes back to what I was saying about how you can only really get close to that original sound in particular synths. You can never quite get the exact tone, in my opinion. What I do actually have is an Ableton preset. This is part of our 90s House Volume 1 presets pack, but what I'll do is I'll also leave this one free. It sounds like this. So that is essentially how I'd approach the source of the sound. Before we even look at audio effects, something I actually like to do is layering the sound. If we return to the fem basso, what I could do is I could essentially flick through different sounds and see if I could find something that complements that lately. We'll maybe have a look at some of these synth ones. Something else I'll do with this kind of lately sound is I'll often layer these kind of textures on top and these kind of other basses. You'll see here we've got this kind of alternative bass, which is quite digital, which is kind of complementing that kind of analog character of the lately. So we've talked quite a bit about the sound itself, which I think is going to be a kind of key thing to consider. But I think the two other areas, which are the MIDI patterns and the audio effects, are also worth considering. So the first thing I want to talk about is going to be the MIDI pattern. When it comes to patterns, I don't think there's any set rules. You can go as basic to as complicated as you want, but I actually tend to find for this specific sound, you can kind of lean more to the simple side. I'll just show you the pattern I wrote. I think I tend to actually prefer opting for those kind of simple patterns just because it kind of allows you more room to let your ideas develop over the project. You'll see I've got all these different kind of bass layers and I've got all these synth layers. What I'll do is I'll go here and I'll let you kind of hear how that kind of simple pattern aids the development of those other patterns. So I definitely prefer that kind of stripped back pattern for this sound, but I have actually used examples where the pattern was a bit more hectic. I think it was this one. This example here basically used a more complicated pattern, and I think this kind of shows what's also possible, but I think for MIDI patterns in general, I tend to prefer the kind of more basic ones. Now that we've touched on the sound and the MIDI patterns, it leaves one final thing to address, which is the audio effects. What we'll do is we'll start with a very basic overview of effects. First thing I would use typically is an EQ. I could do some cleaning to make room for other elements. What I could even do is I could take certain regions and bring out highs a bit more to really kind of shape the tone of that sound even further. What I've also got later on in the chain is a filter, just because that kind of sample I used was almost a bit too harsh in the high end, so what I actually wanted to do was filter it down slightly just to tame it down a bit. So EQs and filters would always be something I'd consider. We've got this compression, just because we're using a sample and I really want to bring in the dynamics, even them out and make it more consistent. What we've also done on the theme of compression is a bit of parallel compression. Basically load a compressor on a return channel, set it up like this and blend the compression into taste. We've got this drum bus, just because it helps to bring out certain harmonics in the sound, which basses often need. The final thing I do is I add this sidechain. This is kind of pretty optional depending on how you set up your pattern. A lot of the time I will have sidechain on my bass groups, but you can get away with using less of it or none of it at all by really considering where you place your notes on like the offbeats and stuff. So I was going for that kind of pumping feel, and this sidechain is really helping to emphasize that. So that would be my basic chain. Obviously music production is great in that you have that freedom to try new effects and that kind of thing. So there's two kind of effects that I'd maybe recommend. The first one is this erosion effect, which basically adds this kind of artificial texture to the sound. Basically you have these kind of three settings. You can blend in noise, you can blend in white noise, but what I like to do is add this kind of sine texture, which adds this kind of grit to the sound. And then what you can simply do is you can play around with the amount, which is basically how extreme the effect is, and the frequency which is being affected. The next one would be the kind of controversial delay. When it comes to basslines, you have to get pretty careful in terms of what you use them on, but I typically find that those kind of higher frequency basslines can benefit from effects like delays. So what I could do is I could add this delay, which you basically use to add extra notes to the patterns. Alright people, that's going to conclude this one. I hope this video gave you a solid understanding of that kind of iconic 90s bass sound that's still making waves in tracks today. It's one of those tried and trusted sounds which I find incredibly versatile, easy to use, and I think the best part about it is it allows you to focus more on the creative process as opposed to that kind of sound selection, which for basses can be a bit awkward sometimes. If you're keen to start working with this sound yourself, there's a free preset linked below to get you going. As always, I'll be leaving a couple of video recommendations on screen if you want to keep exploring. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.